Can you hear me? Hello, everybody. Good early afternoon to you all. My name is Sנייder. I'm a journalist and political blogger, and I'm very happy to chair this important panel about fresh start on Israel relations with the US and Europe. Knowing where we stand with the calls that were heard yesterday in New York when the Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, went upstage in front of Jewish crowds, or when we read about EU High Representative of Foreign Policy, Federica Mogherini, plan to label Israelis products manufactured in the West Bank, we have here in front of us a panel titled, "What Would It Take to Have a Fresh Start of the Relationship Between Israel and the US and Israel and the EU?" It's very interesting. As we all know, the main players, have just re-elected Netanyahu for another term. President Obama will be in office until January 2017. The two leaders just made a record of being the longest-serving parallel couple in U.S.-Israel history, sitting in their respective positions more than Ben-Gurion and Eisenhower, actually. I've heard that they've been dubbed BFF, that's best foes forever. Thinking of a fresh start, I'm referring the question to my panel. We won't have Zalman Shoval here, who I heard he's been sick and couldn't make it. And we will speak with Dr. Tamara Kaufman-Witz from Brookings in Washington, with Professor Gil Troy of McGill University, with Professor Shlomo Avineri, the former director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and with Mr. Dr. Jürgen Rodriguez, the former Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia from Germany. Thank you all, and we'll hear first from Tamara.
Okay. Tal, thank you, and thanks to IDC for the invitation to join you here in הרצליה. Shomim oti? Okay. So I want to just make three very basic points. The first is that Tal began with a little bit of reference to personalities. And there's no question that the most recent period of U.S.-Israel relations has seen some tensions, and a lot of folks in the media seem to be eager to find crisis after crisis. But I think it's important that we look beyond the specific policy issues on which there are some real disagreements, and also that we look beyond personalities, because I think that there are some more fundamental challenges to the U.S.-Israel relationship stretching into the future that we need to understand and take account of. I don't think that they're insurmountable, but there are changes here in Israel and changes in the United States that we have to take into account, and the relationship needs to adapt in response. In Israel, I think those changes are obvious to all of you, and President Rivlin spoke very eloquently about them yesterday, about the ways in which Israeli society has altered, the challenges of social cohesion that presents for Israel. But I think that we see changes as a result as well in Israeli politics and in the way Israeli political leaders engage in foreign policy. It had never been the case before that Israeli political leaders had an incentive, that they won something in domestic politics by beating up on the United States. That's a new development in Israeli politics. It's something Americans need to understand. What's different here that creates those incentives for Israeli political leaders? In the U.S., the political understanding of Israel, speaking as somebody who's spent the last 25 years in Washington, I would say, is kind of outdated. There's a vision of labor and Likud and left and right, and that's about it. The policy discussion of Israel in Washington is similarly quite constrained. When we talk about Israel in policy terms, we talk about the conflict with the Palestinians, we talk about Iran, we talk about terrorism, and that's about it. So there is certainly room on the U.S. side to build a more sophisticated understanding of today's Israel domestically and in terms of politics and foreign policy. And I'm proud to say that at Brookings, this is something on which we're very actively engaged. And after I go back to Washington this week, we'll be launching a new set of research and activities focused on domestic Israeli politics and society, because we want to try and fill this gap. I think, however, though, that there's probably insufficient understanding on this side of the relationship of changes in the United States, in American public opinion, in the infrastructure of American politics, and those changes likewise are producing some shifts in the incentive structure for politicians and some changes in the language that you hear around the relationship with Israel. My colleague Shibli Telhami does regular polling actually here in Israel as well as in the United States on attitudes particularly toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And let me just share a couple of his findings with you, because I think it gets at some underlying realities that we need to grapple with. Americans today say if two states are no longer possible, we ask to them, which do you favor more, Israel's Jewishness or Israel's democracy? And by 71%, Americans, Democrats and Republicans, favor Israel's democracy over its Jewishness. Now, really, this shouldn't be so surprising. In the United States, our political culture that's our civic religion, is democracy. That's what we all have in common. And so it's no surprise that that's the lens through which we view other countries, including this one. But I think it's important to understand that in the U.S., in a bipartisan sense, there's a clear preference on that issue. 63% of Americans oppose settlements, but 61% don't want the U.S. government to do anything more about settlements except criticize. 31% of Americans, when you ask Americans through what lens, when they think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what concerns them about it, okay? The first thing is that 21% of them say they're not concerned about it, okay? But the largest portion, 31%, view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of human rights. And they say that human rights is their greatest concern when thinking about the conflict, even more than the proportion who say that they think about it in terms of American national interests. More look at it through the lens of human rights than through the lens of American national interests. And this, again, I think is related to the civic religion of the American body politic, our democratic values. So I think it's important to understand these underlying attitudes. But when we look ahead, what's really significant is if you take that 31% who look at the conflict through the lens of human rights and you break it down demographically, you find that, first of all, many more Democrats than Republicans use that lens, and many more minorities, African Americans and Hispanics, view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a human rights lens compared to white Americans. Now, why is this significant? First of all, of course, African Americans and Hispanics are not only a core constituency for the Democratic Party, they are a growing core constituency for the Democratic Party. And secondly, it's important because within the next half century, the United States will be a majority-minority society. So these demographic splits help to explain the partisan split that has been much remarked upon over the last months. And for better or worse, this is something that I think Israelis and those who support Israel need to recognize and come to terms with. It's also notable on the right wing of the American political spectrum, the growing importance of evangelicals as a base within the Republican Party, and the fact that evangelicals view Israel through a religious lens to an even greater degree than American Jews. So if we look at the underlying demographics, I think we understand the partisanship a little bit more. Two two quick things I'll say and then conclude. The first is that given these underlying attitudes, given these demographic realities, what we've seen in the last few months, which is political entrepreneurs on left and right using these gaps, exploiting them for partisan purposes, both here in Israel and in the United States, they are exacerbating these trends. They are accelerating the growth of this gap in attitudes. So the partisanship is being somewhat driven by underlying social changes, but it is also driving them faster. And that, to me, is of great concern. The final point I want to make is that despite all the data I just gave you about public opinion, this is not to say that differences between the United States and Israel are just about opinion or about attitudes. There are real policy challenges before us. On Iran, there are clear differences. They've been thoroughly aired, and I think they need to continue to be discussed. In fact, at the policy level, government to government, the U.S. and Israel continue to cooperate closely, can cooperate closely. I think they will continue to cooperate closely. I'm not actually worried about policy coordination and cooperation at the government-to-government level.
Tamara, I will have to stop you. Maybe you leave something for the rest of the panel, because we're going to have a question session.
Okay, can I just make one more sentence to push a little controversial point out there that perhaps my colleagues can discuss?
Controversial? Go ahead.
Okay, I knew you would agree to that. The underlying challenge we have relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which Minister Bennett said yesterday in his remarks, let's agree to disagree and set it aside. I don't think we can afford to do that. And the reason is this. Israel and the United States have stood together and need to stand together on this question. Israelis are asking Americans and American politicians every day to walk down a road with them. The underlying anxiety that I hear from policymakers in Washington is that nobody in the leadership here can tell them where that road is going. And I think until Israel, for itself, has resolved upon a path forward with the Palestinians, whatever that path may be, we're going to continue to have a lot of tension and anxiety around this issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Troy? Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is my first time at the Herzliya conference, and I've discovered what I've learned from many years of living in Israel and being Jewish, is that we love a crisis. Rahm Emanuel famously said to Barack Obama, "You never let a crisis go to waste." And it seemed that the people from the right said, "We're in a crisis. We must hold on to the settlements." People from the left said, "We're in a crisis. We must leave the settlements." And so, but then Kathleen Kennedy Townsend gets up and says, "I love you." And we don't know what to do with that. And I want to look at even the way we frame this panel with two assumptions of crisis. One, that there's a need for a fresh start in U.S.-Israel relations, and two, that U.S. and Europe are the same. And as an American historian, I'm going to follow Tamara's path and focus on America and emphasize that we had this revolution in 1976. In 1776, it continues. We ain't Europe. And the dynamics are very, very different. And the headline is America and Americans, I'm going to focus particularly on popular opinion, remain overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. But to lure you in, let's start with the headaches, because we're more comfortable with the crisis. And there are challenges. I'm calling it, for the sake of this panel, Europeanization. And some of these things overlap with some of the points Tamara made. First of all, we're seeing even in the evangelical community, to the extent that we have the metaphor of Christ at the checkpoint, Israelis being the source of Palestinian suffering, that's a source of great tension and worry. To the extent that we go to the racial analogy and the Palestinians become black, and here we have an example of both Condoleezza Rice, and I'm rushing through so I'm not going to read every one of these slides, but Condoleezza Rice and Barack Obama at different points have used the racial analogy to understand and to empathize with Palestinian suffering. And to the extent that the Palestinians also use it and say, we're Ferguson, we're black, that is a problem, especially with a community that is becoming, a country which is increasingly becoming more multicultural and more colored. And the third is Israel seen as the human rights outlaw, which particularly occurs, of course, on American campuses. And this sits on what I call the Bermuda Triangle, or the unholy trinity of racism, colonialism, imperialism. The three big lies that were concocted in the 1970s to demonize Israel, that were formalized in the UN Zionism as Racism Resolution of 1975, and go back to a very clear strategy which Edward Said worked on from Columbia University, where he said explicitly in the 1970s, if this is a local conflict between Arab and Jew, we lose. But if we can universalize it, and given the fact that in the 20th century the media makes this a globalizing conversation, if we can globalize it and link it at the time to Vietnam, to Algeria, to the liberation from African imperialism, from European imperialism, then we will succeed. Now, I don't think they've succeeded, but they've certainly changed the conversation. And they've made, as Said predicted, the Zionist settler, right? And once settler was a neutral term, or even, on Thanksgiving you walk in and we celebrate the settlers in American schools. Settler was not a negative term, they've made it a negative term. There also is an issue, which Tamara also touched on, which is, and President Rivlin's presentation touched on, which is where are American youth going and where are Israeli youth going? There's an increasing tribalism, a perceived tribalism here in Israel, and a perceived universalism, a cosmopolitanism among Americans. So with all that, the reason why I'm still an optimist is somewhat for a cynical reason. We love to build the American-Israel relationship based on common values, and that's very important. We love to build it based on common interests. But my reading of American foreign policy, going back to George Washington's farewell address and the deep desire for isolationism, is that American foreign policy is often driven more by fears than hopes. What bonded America and Israel for so many years was the Cold War. And there is a question here of what are the central fears in the American-Israel relationship. Is it terrorism, which unites Israel and the United States, or is it this ugly scene from Abu Ghraib and the whole human rights issue, which Tamara was touching on? But my sense is that at the end of the day, and this comes from a Chapman study, saying if you look at when Americans were asked in 2014, what are they most afraid of? Terrorism, world war, economic collapse, decline, nuclear biological attack, it most connects to a certain fear of Islam. Now, it's very important that the pro-Israel community not descend into Islamophobia. What an offense it would be for the Jewish state, built on the repulsion against anti-Semitism, to play the Pamela Geller card, to play on Islamophobia. But to build a coalition that is anti-Islamist, to build a coalition against Islamic extremism, is to me very important and actually an essential underlying link in the American-Israel relationship. But to answer the question that was asked, how do we get a fresh start? First, I again echo what Tamara said, that at the end of the day, especially in the United States, if there's peace, Israel's standing will improve. And not only that, and I'm actually more skeptical about that in certain campuses, certain parts of Europe, because we saw in the 1990s, even as there was an Oslo peace process, the whole BDS infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure, the ideological infrastructure was growing. But in the United States, not only having a peace process, but even just running the peace train. I don't want Barack Obama in charge of the peace process. I don't want John Kerry in charge of the peace process. As a Zionist, I want Israelis in charge of the peace process. And I want Israelis using the same startup nation, out-of-the-box, brilliant creativity and ingenuity to figure this problem out, and not to wait for Big Daddy or Big Mommy to solve it for us. And I think it would have a huge impact on American public opinion. The second is we need new language. To call Barack Obama, and there's all kinds of words we could use to criticize his foreign policy if we disagree with it, but to call him anti-Israel when he believes in the fundamental right of the Jewish people to have a homeland is absurd and is insulting, and recruits too many people who might be critical of Israel but pro-Israel onto the side of the true anti-Israel forces in Europe, in parts of the campus world, and in other parts of the world today. Why do we do that? Similarly, pro-peace, everybody wants peace. We need a new vocabulary, we need a new language, we need a healthier language. And if we had a healthier language, we could then build what we really need, which is a big tent. The fight against BDS, the fight against delegitimization should be a left-right issue. In fact, the more left you are, and now I'm using the conventional terms, the more you want concessions, territorial concessions, the more angry you should be about BDS, the more angry you should be about anti-normalization, the more angry you should be against delegitimization, because there's no way there'll be any kind of compromise. There's no way there'll be any kind of progress if that kind of attack on Israel's very right to exist continues. And so to sum up, God bless America, or God, or whatever higher power you believe in. Bless, protect, and strengthen America and Canada. And we see from this Gallup poll that despite the nuanced questions which sometimes find points of tension between the United States and Israel, if we go back over 10, 20, 30 years, we see not just consistent support among the American people for the state of Israel, and not so much support for Palestinians, but actually a growth over 3 decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor, please.
Thank you. I am a little bit at a disadvantage because I was looking forward to having Zalman Shoval on the panel, and I thought I knew what he would like to say, and then I thought I knew what I would like to say, countering what he would say, and he's not here. So I'm punching, against a position which isn't really presented here. But let me start by 2 statements. I have no illusions that if Israel would have had another kind of government, let's say headed by Yitzhak Herzog, Tzipi Livni, and Zahava Galon, even such a government, unfortunately, to my mind, would not be able to achieve an agreement with the Palestinians in the foreseeable future. Secondly, that at the end of the day, if there's going to be an agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians, be it a final status agreement or a series of partial agreements, this will be achieved only through bilateral negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians with some outside help, as it has been in the past, but it cannot be done from the outside. No ethnic national conflict, neither in Cyprus, nor in Kosovo, nor in Bosnia, nor in Kashmir, was solved by outside powers, despite the fact that the outside powers tried, but they failed. It has to be done by the local players. Having said that, which suggests that I think I'm not naive about alternatives. I think I'm not naive about alternatives. I still feel that the present government, and it's not personalities, it is the ideology behind the present government and the former government, headed by Netanyahu, has achieved something extraordinary. It didn't mean to achieve it, but it did achieve it. It made the disagreement, which is a very deep disagreement, between the Israeli government and the Palestinians, it made this into a disagreement between Israel and the whole democratic world. The fact that there are no negotiations and there is no agreement. As I said, I don't think an agreement is really around the corner, even if we would have a different government. Making the lack of an agreement into a cornerstone of overall criticism coming from practically every corner of the democratic world against Israel is an unusual achievement, a negative one of the Netanyahu government. And it's not going to help. It's not going to help saying that it has to do with anti-Semitism, it has to do with all kind of dark aims against Israel, because this is not true. Anti-Semitism today is not stronger than it was 20 or 30 years ago. What has changed is that after 1967, not only under Labour governments, but also under governments led by Menachem Begin and up to a point also by Yitzhak Shamir, there was a feeling in the democratic West that at the end of the day, Israel would be ready to make considerable concessions to the Palestinians. It doesn't have to be 1967 boundaries, but basically that Israel is not going and is not interested in the long run to control the West Bank and to continue its control over millions of Palestinians. Nobody in the democratic West today really believes that this is the case. There is now a conviction, and it may be a little bit exaggerated, but certainly the Prime Minister and ministers and deputy ministers in the government just sustained this conviction that Israel is interested in maintaining control over the West Bank as much as possible, not necessarily annexing it, because this would be a one-state solution with a large Arab minority with equal rights. No, this is not the case, but maintaining control. And therefore, the issue of settlements and construction settlements and statements which were made by the Prime Minister, which probably helped him win the elections, created alienation from democratic Western public opinion. How do you overcome it? And I think Tamara was right in suggesting it's not personalities, and there are things that can be done by this government, but they are going to be just fluff. They're not going to address the real issues. Gil said earlier, we need a new language. I don't think we need a new language. Language is good for public relations. We need a new policy. If the democratic West, and there are nuances between American position and European position, there are nuances within Europe, there are nuances between governments and publics, one has to realize there is today, and this is a paradox, no Western democratic government challenges the very existence of Israel as a Jewish nation state. No Western democratic government challenges the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in a state of their own. But at the same time, no Western government accepts the idea that Israel will continue to control territory outside its more or less internationally recognized borders. We have seen how the West reacted, not vis-à-vis Israel, but vis-à-vis Russia on the issue of Crimea. And you can argue the issue of Crimea and Ukraine, both sides, but there was a very clear reaction that had to do with an attempt to use force in order to control a territory which was not considered to be part of the Russian legitimately recognized territory, Crimea or eastern Ukraine. This is not going to change. And it's not going to change by a horror campaign that will suggest that everything in the world is done against Israel. Even issues, and this has to do with language, even issues that have to do with boycotts. It's very easy to suggest that there is a boycott movement against Israel, and there is something like that, basically marginal. But the issues that has to do with the agricultural products of the West Bank settlement is not a boycott of Israel. It's not even a boycott of West Bank settlement products. It is trying to suggest something which, according to Israeli law, is also the case, that the West Bank is not part of Israel. This is Israeli law. So I'm not enthusiastic about this European move, but this is not a boycott, not against Israel, not even against West Bank product. It is trying to suggest something which is historically and factually true. We may not like it. I don't like the consequences. But the idea that you create an image, and there are too many ministers in the present government that suggest that the whole world is against Israel's right to exist, is just a lie. And I suggest to the government, if it really wants to reach out to the West, to make distinctions and make very clear, not just on a rhetorical level, but in the way in which it handles issues like construction settlements, certain moves in East Jerusalem, which have to be done not because Israel has no right, according to our law and according to the view of most Israelis, to maintain control over East Jerusalem, but you do not have to make things which are symbolically angering everybody else. Nobody is going in the West to accept continued Israeli control, not of the West Bank as territory, but of millions of the Palestinians living there. There should be no illusions. We don't need a new language. We don't need more hasbara or propaganda or whatever you want to use. We need a new policies, and therefore I'm very pessimistic if this government, with its policies as have been clearly set up in the last few weeks and months, can do it. I regret it very much, but I think we have to realize that one can paper over differences. One can even have a love feast between Obama and Netanyahu. I don't think it's going to happen, but it can happen for political reasons on both sides. But the fundamental issues will not go away, and we have to address those issues. An Israeli government, every Israeli government, and again Tamara said it very clearly, I want to underline, has to tell the American public and the friends of Israel what is the end game that the Israeli government wants to achieve. If it's going to sound like it sounds today, there's not going to be much hope that positions will change. I don't like what I'm saying. I hope it would have been different, but I think after years in which people were accepting the Israeli views that at the end of the day Israel is accepting a two-state solution and is ready to make concessions. The last few months have suggested to even the most non-skeptical believers in this Israeli government position that this is not the inner truth of the government, and we have to say the truth to our own people, and we have to say the truth to the world. And if the consequences are as they are today, we should have no illusion. This is not because the world hates Israel or the world wants to delegitimize Israel. Criticism of Israeli settlements is not a criticism, is not delegitimizing Israel. It's criticism of a policy which no Western government is going to accept and hasn't really accepted for almost 50 years. But Israel was able to convince people that at the end of the day, if there are going to be partners, if there's going to be a willingness on the other side for a reasonable compromise, we are ready for that compromise. I think we have lost the credibility that this is the position of Israel.
Thank you very much. We'll have to stop you there. And our last speaker, Mr. Jorgen, please, the stage is yours.
Professor Aveniri has said he hopes that he has tell us some different. Yes, you have, and that will continue a little bit this way. Our panel has two questions give to us. The first is a fresh start in Israel's relations with the US and Europe. And I will answer this clearly, yes, it is necessary to have a fresh start. With Europe, it is sure. And the second question was, what would it take? And my answer is, first, more security, second, more economic growth, and third, new friends for Israel. I was here at the Hartzlia conference in February 2011. That was a few weeks after the beginning of the Arab Spring. And this conference began with a panel with two charts, and that was a beginning with dark colors. The first chart was the situation in 2011, Israel and his neighbors, and but the whole chart was in blue colors. Blue means that are our friends, or we have collaboration with all our neighbors. And the second chart was a look in the future, what is after the so-called Arab Spring. And this chart was green. A little Israel in blue, and the other neighbors in green, perhaps a little bit other in the colors Jordania. We know that since the beginning of this decade, the situation in the Near East has changed fundamentally. We have heard from my colleagues here on the panel that there are problems with the government from President Obama, and it is not clear what happened in the future with the next president, what is the direction of the government in Washington. If I try to take a question for me and my statement, I believe that the question must say what Europe can and what Europe must do to ensure security in the Near East. And my answer is that Europe is not willing to take over the role of the US as a major stabilizing power in the Near East. And I will say to you the reasons why Europe doesn't not want to be involved too much in the problems of the Near East are clear. The first, the capability of the EU to play a major political role is limited. Second, Europe has no common strategy. Third, many European states have huge economic problems. Fourth, the image of Israel's policy in Europe is not good. And five, Europeans do not understand what the intentions of the Israeli government are. And that means the question of the question, does Israel accept the two-state policy? If these questions are right, and I believe if you ask politicians in Europe or also normal people on the street, you will have answers to the questions who are not good for Israel. But I believe that there is not a point that Israel has lost Europe. If Israel is not able to make clear her strategy, make clear the aims, then that it's possible that you lost Europe. That means that Israel must do more to illustrate clearly what their positions are. I will say something to the situation in Germany. You know that Germany has assumed the obligation to make every effort to support Israel. That is a commitment which we have made with ourselves. That's like our commitment to the integration of Europe. These two things, the security from Israel and the integration in Europe, are part of our self-understanding. And I would add, that is as well, in my opinion, also the part of the European nations, of the European self-understanding. In Europe, however, the awareness of this self-understanding still needs, that is also true, become stronger than it is now. I repeat my question. What can Europe do to ensure Israel's future? Can Europe, in its very own way, contribute to a development that deserves the name of peace process in the strict sense of the word? Our common interest, Europe and Israel and also the United States, is peace. We know, and Professor Avinieri has mentioned it, unilateral actions can encourage but also make peace more difficult. But it is important to remember, peace requires the mutual recognition of the right to exist. And the one who wants to negotiate recognizes it and has to renounce violence. We, I believe it, Europe and Israel have common interest in that Israel is not constantly seen as enemy in the Islamic world. The Islamic world has to recognize that large Jewish and also Christian populations, rich in tradition, always have been resident in this region. There are no foreign bodies here. Our common aim must be that Israel will be accepted as part of the region and at the same time also part of Europe. I'm sure that Europe's special role is that of an enhanced cooperation between the EU and Israel, her future is strong and can do something for the peace process. Israel's relation to Europe are important for Israel, not only for the economic point of view. Europe can, and I believe will help, if Israel stops a policy that leads the country into isolation. For this, it must be clear that Israel is a part of the Western world and a part of Europe. Naturally, it is also a part of the Middle East region. I believe it will be successful to pursue a policy of small steps. I will tell you something.
Maybe we are almost out of time, and
Yeah.
want to go into the questions.
Only this idea, this last idea. We have in Germany good experience with a politic who has a strategy that is called change through rapprochement. That means we must find things we do together in our common interest. And I believe that these three things are that we work together to save the right of existence for Israel. The second, for a better future of Israel neighbors. And the third, for a politic of de-radicalization in the Near East. That's my three suggestions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I would like to refer some questions to the panel. I see that Professor Troy wants to start, but I want to ask you first, before you react to what's been said here. You mentioned universalize or globalize the conflict as, something as a process that happens. And I was wondering, we hear from Israeli politicians such as Yair Lapid and Avigdor Lieberman, the former foreign affairs minister, saying that we have to start, have a fresh start to the conflict by reaching out to the region and getting into the regional players and not just have it as a bilateral process. On the other hand, we heard, I think yesterday, the Israeli Prime Minister says that only bilateral process will solve the issues, and he believes, he said it once again, I think on Sunday, that he still believes in the two-state solution, and he's obviously, those are just words being said, that he's reaching out to the Palestinians to meet and have a bilateral process. So how do you see the American administration has not said anything on that with the regional? Obviously, everybody referred to the Saudi initiative as something that may restart things here.
I always say, as a historian, it's hard enough to predict the past. I can't begin to predict the future. And in the Middle East, it becomes even harder. If we talk about the dynamics in terms of Israel's standing and Israel's image, the most important thing is to show that Israel's trying to do something. So, for example, that cartoon that I showed, where you see Abbas and Netanyahu both with their mouths closed and being recalcitrant, is a devastating image for Israel. Go back to the days of Golda Meir. Now, historians have told us, and we've learned subsequently, that Golda Meir was not Miss Peace, and that she didn't acknowledge the Palestinians. But the perception at the time was that Israelis were thirsting for peace. And the Prime Minister has to show that he is invested in a process, be it bilateral or multilateral, that he believes is going to work, rather than that he's simply marking time. And that's the challenge. And it makes sense for me
so that it's just a PR challenge?
No, it's not a PR challenge. You see, and this is where I respectfully disagree with Professor Avneri, that in the Middle East, and in general, in negotiations and in politics, but especially in a conflict like this, words matter. And in our hieroglyphic civilization, images count, optics count. And we can't make this artificial distinction between policy and politics. That to the extent, going back to what I was saying about delegitimization, to the extent that you lower the temperature around the delegitimization issue, to the extent that you diffuse it, to the extent that you use the delegitimization issue as a way of building left-right within Israel, to work together rather than always being at loggerheads, you can actually make progress on other things like the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this notion that it's simply a matter of going into back rooms and negotiating some kind of perfect policy, we actually saw one of the failures of Oslo was that it was very top-down. We didn't work on the grassroots. We didn't work on the optics enough, and somehow it didn't last. And so we had all kinds of images of Israeli negotiators and Palestinian negotiators bonding, but not enough in the ground.
But what if I say to you that the Palestinians are unwilling to have those photo ops or to have all those, sort of just process for the process, and obviously they are refusing right now
and that's
for quite a long time.
And that's the problem with anti-normalization and the boycott, right? And so we can sit here and make nuanced distinctions between boycotting West Bank products versus not, but if you read the BDS vision on the websites, if you listen to Omar Barghouti, they don't make that distinction. They actually want to use the general disgust with Israeli policies on the West Bank, this general disgust with Israeli settlement policy, to broaden the conversation and to lead to the delegitimization of the very idea of the state.
Okay.
And that's the challenge.
Professor Ravineri, I've listened carefully to what you said, and what we've been hearing in the last week or maybe 2 weeks since the BDS, sort of jumped on us, even though everybody who deal with it were aware to the process. But I think the Israeli public was, overexposed in the last 2 weeks. And what I've been hearing from Israeli leaders is just have even from the left wing, have the process for the process just in order to lower down, the fight or lower down the perceptions. And you don't hear any messages coming out, even from the left, saying we just need to move on with the peace itself. We just need to have a better relationship, have a better discourse, but not deal with the issue itself. And it seems like a PR fight more than a real substance one.
Well, you mentioned earlier Yair Lapid and Avigdor Lieberman mentioning the regional dimension.
The regional, he said that yesterday in New York.
And I think it's an important aspect, but one has to be frank and truthful about it. Because it seems to me that people like Yair Lapid and Avigdor Lieberman, who never told us what they would like to see as the outcome of bilateral Israeli-Palestinian relations, then they tell us, let's go to the regional dimension, because they do not want to tell themselves and the public what their aim is on the bilateral relation. I understand it for political reasons. So when one talks about the regional dimension, one should take into account two issues. I think when the Arab Peace Initiative came out of Beirut as a Saudi initiative, I think the Israeli government, this was not the Netanyahu government, this was the Olmert government, made a major mistake. Rather than disregarding it, it should have welcomed it, saying this is very important that the Arab League, for the first time, considers a possibility of peace with Israel. This is a great step forward compared to Khartoum. On the other hand, when one looks at the Arab Peace Initiative, it is not a call for negotiations with Israel. It set out 3 parameters: 67 boundary settlements, Jerusalem and refugees, and says that if Israel accepts the Arab-Palestinian view, then Arab nations will normalize relations with Israel, which is really not exactly an ultimatum to Israel, but as close as you can do. Having said that, I think we should have responded the way we should respond. On the other hand, to talk about a regional arrangement today, when the Arab League does not exist as a political power, when Arab countries are fighting each other, when there are civil wars in Arab countries, it's not just realistic.
Would you accept the Obama administration to refer to the Arab Initiative just now? I mean, I
don't care, very frankly, I don't care what the Obama administration does on this issue, because the Obama administration has failed about everything that it tried to do in the Middle East. It's failed in Iraq, it failed in Syria, it failed on Israel-Palestine, it's even pushed the Egyptians into the hands of the Russians. So the Obama administration is not, for me, the answer to a white Western policy. I think the Obama administration is a failure when it comes to foreign policy, and it is a failure when it comes to Middle Eastern policy. I'm concerned about what Israel does. On the other hand, there are, and it's very clear, there are at the moment some very clear common interest between Israel and some of the, let's say, more moderate Arab countries. I'm not sure I'd like to call the Saudis a very moderate country, because, it's the most Islamic fundamentalist country, much more fundamentalist than Iran. But I don't like to say it's not politically correct. But it is, on our issues much more moderate than other countries. And it's not a secret, and I don't know everything, but I mean, we know something, that there are contacts and there are understanding not only above board with Egypt, but also with Saudi Arabia and possibly also with Arab countries, and they should be encouraged. But this is not going to lead to an agreement on the Palestinian issue. This is not going to lead to an agreement of Saudi Arabia accepting the Israeli policy on Jerusalem. They're not going to accept it. One has to make a distinction between what is realpolitik, where there can be a lot of common interest between us and some Arab countries. This has been also the case in the past, not the first time. And one shouldn't have illusions by saying this is going to be the key to the issue which we do not want really to address, which is how do we deal bilaterally with the Palestinians. And I'm saying it with all my skepticism about how much can be achieved with the Palestinians. I'm not naive about it, but one has to very clearly suggest that we are not running away from those issues.
Thank you. Tamara, you just wanted to react, and also I wanted to refer to your earlier things you said, and you mentioned the minorities in the states, and you said some of the things that were done lately where leaders were driving things apart even further than instead of working, to combine leadership of communities. And I was wondering if you had an example for that. Or how do you think the Israeli government should outreach? I'm sure it's not doing enough on outreaching. I mean, it's been like that since I was in D.C., a Washington, D.C. correspondent. The Israeli community wasn't outreaching to blacks or Hispanics. So I was wondering if you've seen anything changed on that issue.
Okay, well, look, let me say a few things. Number one, with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and efforts to resolve it, I think we've just had a big discussion about process. And the process is really not the point. And the idea that process for the sake of process can somehow rescue us from the actual dilemmas that we face on the ground, I think we have to set this aside. But there are two mythologies that were very, very prevalent during the Oslo era. Look, the problem we face today is that the Oslo framework, direct bilateral negotiations mediated by the United States, that framework exhausted itself. And it exhausted itself before Prime Minister Netanyahu said whatever he said the day before the election. And everybody knew it, but everybody was still holding on to the process because it served a variety of useful functions. And now we can no longer do that. Okay? So that's the world we're in. But the two mythologies were on, I think, the international side, the idea that the peace process has its own momentum. And that if Israelis and Palestinians are talking to each other over time, this will get them to a solution in and of itself. We know that's not the case. But the other mythology is here in the region, not only among Israelis, but among your many Arab neighbors. And having spent my entire career working in this region, in the Arab world as well as in Israel, I can tell you that this is an incredibly prevalent myth. And it's that the United States is omnipotent. And everything that happens here is because of what decisions were made in Washington. And the idea with respect to the Oslo process is that the mediating presence of the United States would somehow compel Israelis and Palestinians to come to a solution that otherwise they would not have done. Okay, so let's set aside these two mythologies, that the peace process has a momentum of its own, and that the presence of the United States in and of itself will compel an agreement. And then we have to figure out what kind of peace infrastructure, architecture, will actually enable Israelis and Palestinians to build a future of coexistence, whatever that looks like. Because neither of you is moving away. That's the question we face today. It's much more fundamental than these issues of process and hasbara. Now, with respect to outreach, what I'll say is this. Israel is a vibrant, loud, feisty democracy. The United States is a vibrant, loud, feisty democracy. And the great thing about democracies is that we can see into one another's domestic politics. It's visible, it's transparent. We can understand the debates that are taking place. The downside of that is that sometimes we end up penetrating one another's debates. in ways that we don't always recognize or appreciate. And it happens sometimes quite often, that political actors in one domestic arena have an advantage in using the relationship or some depiction of the relationship on behalf of their domestic political agenda. We can't do anything about it. That's democracy. But we should recognize what's domestic politics and what's not. So I'm not going to condemn anybody for doing what they do. I'm just recognizing that the net effect, certainly over the last 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, has been, I think, to exacerbate tensions in the bilateral relationship and to obscure the real issues that we need to address together.
Thank you. Dr. Rodriguez, you said at the end of your speech that Israel is going into isolation, and Europe thinks Israeli should, and maybe with the help of the European, think how to stop this isolation. Did you really see from there an isolation and the process that must be stopped? Can you give an example?
You discussed here on the panel, or we discussed on the panel, that there are great problems. Professor Avineri says he doesn't believe that it is possible without a right-wing government to find a solution here for the peace process. I believe he's right. But the problem is, if you have something like this, you must have a majority in your own country. And if you try to find a solution only in your own country, it is very complicated to have a majority in your own country. And therefore, I believe it is necessary to do it together. And I've told about the situation in Europe, and we have heard something about the situation in the United States. Surely, if it is a point of the right of existence of Israel, and there's something which do together, the United States and also Europe will help, and we do it, and we do it each day. And the collaboration on the military level, it's very good. But that's not the way to have a majority in your people. You must have ideas. You have, perhaps you say, another language for this. And I will tell you a little story.
Okay. I was wondering in what way do you see the isolation?
I will say we have now the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I help them to try that Israel will be part on the university level, part of the Bologna process. That means that Israel is part of a Western community with 47 countries. There's no reason why it is not possible. There's no reason why Israel has a problem with it. As we have discussed it, there's a training center here for the universities, 56 universities in Israel. That's one little step. And you can have steps like this. And perhaps you can remember, you see what the Palestinian Authority do. They try to have a new platform on the international level. And that's the point I make. You must have on one side, you have the war against terrorism, you have necessary to have security here for Israel, for the right of existence. But the government, this government and also the former government, doesn't enough to have sympathy in the people of the United States and Europe. And that's the fresh start we have now. The normal people in Europe must understand why it is in his interest to help Israel and to do something for future here in the Near East. That's the point. The other way, you have no majority. Also, no majority here in Israel. It's too divided in the discussion. You have mentioned it yourself.
Thank you. Professor Avineri, you mentioned earlier, I saw you wanted to react, but I also wanted to ask you, you said the Western countries, the democracy won't accept, continuing of the occupation of holding other people, but we do see they agree to that for many years now. We always say they will not agree, they will, isolate us, but this is not facts on the ground. It is. They do agree. The administration may say Every other month, the spokesperson of the State Department may say, we oppose the settlements, but that's it. And they're living with it perfectly.
Well, let me put it very bluntly. All Western governments have always opposed settlements. Not one Western government has ever...
But they don't really oppose it, because...
Opposed. They said they opposed.
They say it, but...
But at the end of the day, they still believe that there will be a compromise, and Israel will be willing to make a compromise. Today, it's not just opposing, but today is moving from opposing it on the verbal level to making steps which will make it difficult for Israel to continue this policy. Now, again, I'm not naive. There is no Western pressure on Israel, no American pressure on Israel, no European boycotts of one sort or another will change the views of the Israeli government. But it will make it much more difficult for him to maintain it, and it will isolate Israel. So it's one thing if you get a statement that you are against settlements, which you have always had for the last 40 years.
Exactly.
And or you have practical steps which have economic, political, and also moral implications. If I may just...
But judging by experience, what is different now? I mean, it's not... It's. I mean, they've been saying it forever.
What is different now? Look at the hysteria in this country. When somebody at Orange says something in Cairo, which is a little ambivalent, but certainly unpleasant to Israel. This has never been said by anybody else, and there may be other things. Or another union, a student union in Britain, takes a verbal statement which is not pleasant, it's not going to have consequences, but it didn't have before. And this country is hysterical about it. And there is an Israeli government that doesn't like it, but realize that this is a very, very useful political weapon for internal mobilization, and one has to be very much aware of it. Let me just say one word about myths. There is another mythology, that either we have the status quo, or we have war, or we have a final status agreement. I think that the time has come, and I'm saying it especially to our European friends, to realize that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is similar to Cyprus, Kosovo, Bosnia and Kashmir, with its multidimensionality, not just territorial, issue of history, legitimacy, holy places, terrorism, refugees, etc., etc. In none of those conflicts has the international community succeeded, despite the fact that it tried, in Cyprus very dramatically, also in Kosovo, to reach a final status agreement, and it hasn't reached it. And nobody thinks that there is going to be a final status agreement in Cyprus, but people in Cyprus are talking. They're talking even if they're treading water. But the fact that people are talking creates a different atmosphere and makes it possible to have unilateral steps agreed tacitly by the other, as in the case of Cyprus, some arrangements about municipal governments in Kosovo. And I think we should move from the mythology that one has to have a final status agreement to a much more realistic approach that suggests, absent a final status agreement and without losing face in the horizon of a two-state solution, both sides can do certain things not as an alibi for not reaching an agreement and not for a substitute, but as a step towards this kind of horizon. And this can be done on the Palestinian side, it can be done on the Israeli side. I think it will be very helpful if on the European side there will be a realization that if you can't solve Nicosia from Europe or Brussels, you can't save Jerusalem. I mean, it's a little bit of chutzpah to imagine that you can solve Jerusalem if you can't solve Mitrovica. One has to be realistic about what can be achieved, and I think that the friends of us and the friends of the Palestinians and the Middle East should move down from this absolutist belief and mythology that one needs a final status agreement here and now to a much more realistic thing that can be learning from other similar cases which are not as complicated as our case.
From what I've heard from...
That's my suggestion, to make a politic with little steps. That's it, like Willy Brandt.
Precisely.
To make a little steps. We have this experience in the time when Germany was divided. That's not an alternative to the security questions, but it is a politic for the next years to find more understanding between the partners.
If it's up to you, Herzog is in the government tomorrow in order to create a majority of agreement, right? If I understood you correctly. But if what I'm hearing from the panel is that in order to have a fresh start with the United States or the European Union, Israel has to make clear of what's its agenda and where it's going, what it's the policy. It's really unclear. I think both to the Israelis, it's unclear what is the agenda. Do I have time to take questions from the audience, or do I have to finish up? Because, okay.
Can I say one thing? Can I say
yes, sure, go ahead.
One more myth to put on the table, and I know I'm going to get in trouble. There's no such thing as the settlements. The old city of Jerusalem, Golan, settlements within the Clinton plan, settlements outside the Clinton plan. When we talk about the settlements, we create a kind of organic entity, which is very complicating and very inflammatory and not true.
Well, even Israelis are not fully aware of the fine differences between what's going on up in the Golan and what's going on in the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem. So it's definitely very, very complicated. So
let me just make it. One of the reasons why there is no great outcry about the Golan in the West, and we annexed the Golan, which is much more far-reaching.
Except for Bennett calling here yesterday for the world to get involved on that.
The reason is that the issue on the Golan is basically a territorial issue. The issue on the West Bank is that has to do with people and people as a nation. And therefore people are much more sensitive to it rather than the territorial issue of a few square kilometers on the Golan.
It's also much more of a religious,
it's a human issue, and therefore the human rights issue is so very sensitive.
And it also has much more religious attachment to the West Bank and to location in the West Bank, then we do have to...
well, that's the Israeli position.
Yes.
But nobody talks about the 3 Jewish villages occupied on the Golan Heights, which are under Israeli occupation and are oppressed by the Israelis. The issue is territorial and strategic, while the West Bank has to do with human rights and the right of self-determination of another people, and therefore people are sensitive to that issue.
Thank you very much, Professor Avineri. Thank you, Tamara Kaufman-Witz. Thank you, Professor Giltroy, and thank you, Jürgen Rodriguez from Germany. I want to thank you, everybody, for listening.